Hello, and welcome back to the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. I am Kostas, and I am joined once again by my faithful companion, Andrew.
I try to be as faithful as I can. It's great to be back with you, Kostas.
And I know you all missed this. How did you ever make it without us all this time? I have no idea, but the important thing is...
It's hard for me to imagine.
The important thing is we are back. After several months of hiatus, we have come back to deliver you the content that you expect and demand from Gray Fox. So we thought that this would be a great opportunity for us to delve into one of the more interesting topics that I think we've covered here in the past, and that is, as the title says, fear of conversational Latin. So you might think that this is just something that is very broadly spoken of, and for the most part that's true. But as we have done in the past, we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of this situation. We're going to talk about all the different aspects involved in the fear of conversational Latin, and it is my great hope that by the end of this broadcast, anyone who's listening to this who had, and notice the tense I'm using, a fear of conversational Latin, will have it no more. What do you think about that, Andrew? Do you think we can dispel the fear today?
I'm hoping we can. It's a scary thing for a lot of people if you've never done it before. So if you've learned Latin with the 20th century approach, we can call it, which is 100% grammar and translation, and you've never spoken Latin before, you've never used it conversationally, it can be a really frightening thing to get into that. And I know there are a lot of teachers out there who would really like to, but they just don't know how. You know, they don't know how to get past that. And I do hope that we can, maybe figure some of that out today.
That is definitely the goal. And you started off with an excellent point about this 20th century Latin education. And it really comes down to the fact that most teachers just aren't ever taught to speak Latin. And that's a big part of it. If you haven't had experience with something, you tend to be a little more frightful of it, which really goes to human nature, I would say. But particularly when we're talking about something as foreign, pardon the pun, if there is a pun there, a concept is speaking Latin.
Yeah, obviously the ideal is that you would be speaking Latin as early as possible in your education. If students do that, then they don't have that fear. It's a normal thing for them. It's something they've done from the beginning. But if you've gotten a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a PhD, and you've never spoken the language, then it can be tough. It can be really tough. And of course, most of the Latin teachers of our generation never had the opportunity to do that in the context of their Latin educations. Some of them have managed to do it outside of that, but those people have really had to, they've had to go out and do it. They've had to decide it was something they really wanted to do, that they needed to do it, that it was something that was going to be enjoyable for them, that was going to be fun, and then they did it. But then there are a lot of people who just, maybe they wanted to, but they didn't know how to get there.
Yeah, and that's oftentimes something that stops people from doing things, is that they just don't quite know where to begin. And I think especially when we're talking about, again, something that in some circles is seen as radical, is speaking the Latin language. It's just something that happens right away that you think, well, I can't even fathom this. I would have no idea where to begin, so I won't even begin. And fortunately, we have advanced to the point now, and we'll talk a little more about this later on in the show, but we've advanced to the point now where that's not an issue anymore. There are resources that exist to help people to learn how to speak Latin. And I know you are as well, but I'm very excited to tell people about some of those resources, some of which we have gotten our hands involved in a little bit.
Right. So, I mean, how did everybody learn Latin to begin with? They had a textbook, right?
Yeah.
They
Of
had a
course.
textbook. They followed the textbook.
Well,
Was a
there was
teacher
that one
that,
guy I met once. I think he came from the future or something, or he had a time machine, and he said, I grew up in ancient Rome, and I learned how to speak Latin, and now I don't know what I'm doing here in your country. So I don't know what happened to that guy, but
he came from the
everybody else used
future.
a textbook. Yeah,
He came from the future, so Rome's coming back again.
yeah, apparently.
Well, so the reason I brought up a textbook is that, in fact, I've written a textbook. And it is a textbook for conversational Latin that talks about how to teach conversational Latin to your students. And at the same time, it can teach you how to learn it yourself. The way to get from point A, which is usually no experience speaking the language, to an advanced level where you're able to speak the language fluently. So, Costas, I was wondering, you speak Latin, right? That's something you do.
That is something I do. Yes.
How did you start doing that? What happened?
Now, that's a very interesting story, and I'm mighty glad you asked the question, because I'd love to tell people how this happened. So, when I first started learning Latin, way back in high school, which is a very long time ago now, I could not understand why people didn't speak Latin. Now, right away, this is strange, I know, to most of you who are hearing this, because, again, Latin not being thought of as a spoken language, you think, well, why would anyone think this way? But I had the exact opposite reaction. I wanted to speak Latin. Now, of course, there weren't very many people around who did that, other than my high school teacher, Mrs. Paternoster, whose name I love to tell people whenever I get the chance, because why wouldn't you? We're talking about Latin. Somebody with a name like Paternoster, it just fits.
It's really hard for me to believe that that's a real name.
It's a little hard to, yeah, people, I do get that reaction from people every now and then, but I swear on everything that it is true. That was her name. And, I mean, what else would she have taught? I mean, come on. I mean, it's not like she was going to teach, French or something, or no offense to our French language teacher friends.
No. Her fate was sealed, really. Yeah, absolutely. She was born to be a Latin teacher.
And it actually began one day, and I credit her for my love of Latin to begin with, but I credit her for the spoken aspect of my love of the language as well. I noticed one day, just from a distance, in the hallway, she would sort of stand outside in the hall and monitor the students walking through the hall, to make sure they got to class on time and there was no loitering going on and things like that. So one day I saw one of her students walk by her, and they spoke Latin to each other. And, it wasn't anything heavy. It was a very light banter. And she would say, salve to the student. And the student would say, oh, salve, quid agis? And just little things here and there, back and forth. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to speak Latin just like that. That's exactly what I want to do with the language. And look, there's somebody else who's doing it. So I thought, all right, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to the library. I'm going to look up anything and everything I can about conversational Latin. And that led me to the Troutman book, which the title of which escapes me at the moment, Conversational Latin something or other. Help me out here, Andrew. You know this book, right?
Well, it is called Conversational Latin. Fortunately, I am on the internet right now, and so we can easily look this up. So, Conversational Latin for Oral Proficiency.
That's it. I couldn't remember the second half of it, but yes. And I was reading through it, and I thought, this is fantastic. This is exactly what I want. And so I made it a point, maybe it was in a day or two, the next day, a day or two after that, when I walked down that hall, and she was standing there, and I said, salve, magistra. Of course, we were using the classical pronunciation, and she said, salve. And we had a conversation back and forth. And this became a regular thing. And I'm happy to say that our conversations actually were a little bit more than just, hey, how are you doing today? We would talk about the weather. We would talk about, I remember asking her about cookies once, if she baked cookies. That was fun. crustula coquisne, or something like that, I think I said to her. And of course, it's one thing if a couple of words are exchanged in the process of students going from class to class during their busy day. They're not going to pay much attention to that. But when an actual Latin conversation breaks out in the middle of the hallway, that tends to get people's notice. So they were paying attention to this, and they all kind of marveled at it and said, what are those people saying? What's going on? These hushed whispers back and forth. And somebody had to explain to them, I think they're speaking Latin. And somebody said, what? I didn't know you could do that. And just the sheer astonishment on people's faces when they found out what was going on. I mean, there was a sense of satisfaction in me just from that alone, aside from the fact that we were speaking Latin and it was happening. It was alive. It was right there. So that was a beautiful thing, and I looked forward to doing that every single day up until the day she retired, unfortunately, and left in my senior year. Actually, it was at the end of my junior year. But that is where my love of conversational Latin was kindled. And I have carried that with me throughout the years. I very much attempted to incorporate it in my teaching as I went along and went through my college years. And of course, the nature of universities being so conservative really kind of stifled that. Having taught at a university for 7 years as I did, and the people that I worked with were very open-minded, don't get me wrong, and they were open to a lot of different things. But as it is for many teachers now, there are certain things that have to be done and certain allowances that necessarily cannot be made because of that. You have a certain amount of things you have to fit in and a certain way that you have to do things sometimes. And unfortunately, quite often conversational Latin did not make the cut there. And that's another thing that I think gets in the way for a lot of teachers. They don't have the freedom they would like to be able to incorporate it.
Well, so I'll tell you something that I find very satisfying. And that is students who are taking Latin for the first time. When we integrate conversation into their teaching, they don't know the difference. So it seems normal to them. It's only with us old people that it seems strange that Latin would be spoken. Actually, to people who are just beginning to learn it, it seems totally normal. Well, you speak Spanish, you speak French, you speak German. Why wouldn't you speak Latin? There's no reason not to. And they have a whole lot more fun doing it. Now, I also had my own personal experience in learning to speak Latin. Unlike you, I didn't do it until pretty late in the game. So I'd already gotten my bachelor's degree in Latin. It was a number of years after college. And the first time I did it was actually on Facebook. It was right when people were starting to use Facebook. Everybody ran from MySpace. They went over to Facebook, and I joined a bunch of Latin groups, and I made friends with this guy who was living in Perth, Australia, and he just started conversing in Latin with me. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is interesting. And I did it back. I did my best to keep up. This is something he'd done before. I'd never done it, but I really enjoyed it. I mean, I have to say I was very excited to do this for the first time. We did this through texting. It wasn't a voice thing. So it was a little bit easier to start with that. But I'll tell you, I had such a hard time over the years learning vocabulary. It was always the toughest thing, and it is for every student. Yeah. The students just cannot learn vocabulary. I mean, this, Costas, because it just, it doesn't work for the normal human brain to actually learn it that way. But if you use these words in conversation, you learn them very quickly and you never forget them. And honestly, I chatted with him for about an hour every day for a couple months. And we did after that as well. But I remember after a couple months, my vocabulary, I had learned more vocabulary in those 2 months than I had in the past 10 years.
Yeah.
before
And
that.
this comes down to very basic principles. I mean, if you use something in the way it's intended to be used, then you're going to learn it, because no one intended anyone to learn a language by trying to memorize a list of words off a sheet of paper. And that's what we try to force students to do when it comes to Latin.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think if people step back a little bit and they think about it just for a few seconds, they realize what an impossible thing it is that they're asking students to do. And if they understood how rapidly students learned vocabulary through conversation, then I think every teacher would figure out how to make it a big part of his or her curriculum. Because it works so much better than anything else. I mean, flashcards. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that conversation works 100 times better than flashcards.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think about that, Kostas?
Oh, no, I completely agree. And again, it's this sort of artificial way of learning something. And, you know, we've had many talks about this, but my feeling is at least that if you're going to do something like that, if you're going to have lists of words, if you're going to have flashcards, then at least balance it out and have the other side of it, the practical application of the language. I mean, this is sort of the idea of language. It's meant to be used to communicate. You know, it's not meant to be memorized and tucked away and not proliferated, I guess, is the word I want to use there.
Well, yeah, and speaking Latin makes it so much more fun. In our classes that we have, and you know, we partially do things in the 20th century way, using grammar and translation. That's part of it. But then the other part is conversation. Without exception, the students say that the conversation class, and we have one conversation class a week, is their favorite part of the course. It's enormously fun for the students, and it's also fun for the teacher, I can say. I mean, that is my favorite class to teach. So it isn't just effective, and it is extremely effective. It also makes the language so much more fun.
Yeah. I mean, those conversations I would have with my teacher were, you know, they were some of the highlights of my day. And, you know, that may give you an idea of how interesting a person I was in high school. aside from that, which I'm sure some of us can relate to better than others, I don't know. I honestly don't know that I ever would have learned Latin as well as I did without those conversations. And, you know, this is not something that took an enormous amount of time. This is something that happened just in the passing, of my normal day. Maybe it would take a minute and a half or something, but just knowing that there was an outlet for me to have that time to use the language, to speak the language. It, like you're saying, Andrew, it was so much more fun. I thought, wow, I can use this word. I can make sentences now that I couldn't have made before. I can say things now I never would have said before. And I felt sorry for the other students who didn't care, or didn't know, or weren't interested in that. You know, and I thought, you know, how much more difficult must it be for them to try to learn the language without being able to speak it?
Right. And I want to say, I don't feel that conversation is a replacement for grammar and translation.
No. Yeah.
I think they both need to be done.
Mm-hmm.
So you need that grammar and translation approach so the students know the grammar. I mean, they can't speak the language without knowing the grammar very well. It's not like going from English to French or English to Spanish, where the grammar is essentially the same. It's very different, so they've got to know how it works. But then, as soon as possible, they need to start using it conversationally. And they need to develop that conversational understanding of the language, which is different from the understanding they have when they're just translating the language. Mm-hmm. Now, I think there are probably a lot of teachers who've come to the same conclusion we've come to. So they've had a certain amount of experience speaking the language. They've seen how helpful it can be. And, they want to take it to the next step. They want to really learn how to speak Latin, but they're not sure how to get there.
Yeah.
And there are just a lot of barriers that make it difficult.
Yeah, and one of the most popular things that you'll encounter if you do want to get into conversational Latin are these groups and events that are held a lot of times. But the results on these things are mixed, I would say.
Right. So you're talking about something that might happen once a year, right? Mm-hmm. And people, you go to a place for the weekend, there are a bunch of people there who speak Latin to each other, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah. And a lot of times things like that are really overwhelming to people who haven't had the experience. And, we've just gotten done talking to a lot of different people about this sort of thing where they're feeling like they're going to be expected to speak perfect Latin right out of the gate, or they're going to be thrown into a situation for which they don't have the requisite knowledge. Maybe they have trouble with vocabulary themselves in a spoken setting. And so that adds to the fear. They're afraid of that. It's just too much to deal with for a beginner. And again, as you were saying, Andrew, it's just not a consistent thing. And we say this all the time, especially you. You say this a lot, and he does say this a lot every day. Consistency is paramount. And those types of events are these, sometimes they're one-offs or they're irregular in their scheduling. And when you're trying to learn a language, that's not sufficient.
No, I mean, you need to be doing it year round, ideally every day, a certain amount. So if you want to get good at speaking Latin, you have to do it consistently. And also, you can't just jump into a situation where you're trying to communicate with advanced speakers. You've got to start at the beginning and work up. And unfortunately, most people haven't been able to find a situation that would allow them to do that. But that's how it has to be done. If you're going to learn how to do it, you have to take it step by step. You have to start with very simple sentences, very simple conversations, and then work your way up over the course of years to a complex conversation.
Mm-hmm. So something else that adds to the fear as well for teachers, and I think, I've run into a number of teachers that, we said this at the top of the show, since most of these teachers have never spoke it when they were learning it, they simply don't know how to do it, and they're afraid that would make them seem maybe less legitimate in the long run.
Yeah. So you're talking about the fear of being outed, right?
Yes. Okay. We could call it that.
Right. So everybody will know that you're not a real expert in the Latin language. Everybody assumes that you know it perfectly, that you're fluent in it, but you can't actually speak it. And people don't want to be put into a situation where they don't know what they're doing. Teachers want to look as though they really know what they're doing. So that is a very reasonable fear, I think, that a lot of teachers have.
And miss so much when you don't speak the language too. And I'll say this as diplomatically as I can. I think that the teachers who don't speak the language are just missing out on something great about it, and they're not getting the full scope that they otherwise could. And again, I go back to my high school teacher, and she was a tremendous teacher, but part of what made her a tremendous teacher was her ability to speak the language. That was part of it. She would have been regardless, in my own view, but that's something that unless you have that particular knowledge, you know that much about the language, and you can use it in that way, I don't think you can truly connect with it. And if you're going to teach something at maximum level, at maximum ability, you should be able to connect with it on the highest level. That's my opinion, at least.
Right. So I have a feeling that a lot of people would agree with you, but we come back to the question, how do you make that happen? How do you get from A to B? Kostas, what do you think?
That's a great question, and I'm going to leave you in suspense for just a moment, because right now it's time for us to take a quick time out, and we will be right back after this message from Gray Fox Tutors. We know that many Latin teachers out there would like to learn to speak the Latin language and to be trained in teaching conversational Latin, but they just haven't had the opportunity to develop these skills. If this describes you, please consider attending the Gray Fox Conversational Latin Workshop. These classes are open to all current, former, or prospective Latin teachers and are held live online through Skype. We even provide professional development credits for all attendees. The workshop classes are held weekly and are an hour long. Teachers can start at any time. For more information on class times or to register for our Conversational Latin Workshop, please email us at info@grayfoxtutors.com. That's info@grayfoxtutors.com. We hope to see you there. Okay, we're back. And just as we went to break, Andrew, you had a scintillating question that you posed to me.
It was a pretty good question. Yeah.
Yeah. Remind us again what that question was.
Okay, well, it's fine saying that Latin teachers should learn to speak the language, but how do they get there? We've gone over the problems that exist. Obviously there are events that exist you might be able to go to once a year, but you're thrown in with people who are speaking at an advanced level. Most of the time, beginners can't keep up. And then also, it's just not consistent. So it makes it impossible for people to learn to speak the language well. Mm-hmm. The same thing applies to a lot of conversational Latin groups that exist. Maybe they happen once a week. People get together. But it's the same sort of situation. There is better consistency, but still what normally happens is a new person comes and there are a bunch of people there who are speaking Latin at an advanced level, and the newcomer cannot keep up and doesn't know how to, get to where the other people are. Mm-hmm. How is that done? How do you actually learn how to speak Latin? There's got to be some sort of effective way to get there.
Well, with all apologies to Julie Andrews and The Sound of Music, let's start at the beginning. A very good place to start. Let's start at the most basic level, because that tends to work for most things. So I think that's something that can be applied to conversational Latin as well. Start at the most basic level and start with things like I was talking about with my own high school teacher, just simply saying, hello, how are you doing? And, I didn't automatically jump into asking her questions about her cookie baking. It took time to work up to that. So we started on little things, and then we worked our way up. But when you start at the beginning, stay on it for a while, because your brain has to get used to using the language in a different way. Doesn't the brain take on sort of this different task managing in a way, Andrew?
It's a very different cognitive experience speaking Latin than the experience you have when you're translating Latin. The first thing is, when you're speaking it, you don't get to look at the entire sentence all at once, which is how we all learn to do it in the beginning. When we learn to translate, you look at the whole sentence and then you jump around the sentence. Exactly. And you don't do that when you're speaking it. You have to understand words as they come to you. And you have to gradually understand the meaning of a sentence as it's spoken, the same way you do in English. Of course, Latin is not the same as English.
Nope.
The sentences are not put together in the same way, and the elements in a sentence can really be put in any order the speaker wants. And that means that your brain has to kind of let go of this idea that a sentence has to be in a particular order. And if we have English as a first language, then we all have that idea deeply ingrained. And you have to unlearn it. And the way to unlearn it is just to do it, is just to converse and converse and converse. And ideally, make it tough on yourself. So move the words around in the sentence.
Yeah, I mean, as native English speakers, I'm sorry for interrupting you, Andrew.
No, go on.
As native English speakers, we are ingrained in this subject, verb, object, word order. But that's something that you really need to free yourself of when you're trying to learn to speak Latin, because that's not how it's done most of the time. And as rigid as English can be, there are instances when you can play around with the word order a little bit. And so I would encourage people to do that even in their regular lives. Even if you're not speaking Latin, be a little freer with your English word order so you don't stay stuck in that mindset of always having to put the subject and the verb and then the object, just the way that we do all the time, because that's how we learned it. It's very, very different when you're working with Latin, as you said.
Well, when I'm teaching Latin to beginning students, and this is particularly the case if, say, I've been tutoring the students and I have a lot of time to work one-on-one with the student, what I will do is I will stick to very simple questions and answers for a long time. So I won't feel that there's any rush to move on to longer sentences. My focus will be on creating as much variation within those short sentences as I possibly can. So asking the same question in a bunch of different ways, putting the words in a lot of different orders, and then making the student do the same thing with the responses. So what I have done is, in the beginning, I'll just let the student put the words in whatever order he or she wants. And it always turns out to be English word order.
Of course.
Every single time. So
yes,
that's what they want to do in the beginning. But then I will say, okay, there's a new rule. And the rule is that the subject, you can't put the subject first in the sentence. You're not allowed. It has to be another word. So the subject has to go someplace else. And then I will get more and more specific. I'll say, for the next 5 minutes in your answers, the verb always has to come first in the sentence. Then the verb always has to come last in the sentence. Then the verb can be neither first nor last in the sentence. And in this way, using simple sentences, I get the student used to this idea. I mean, you can tell the student that it can be in any order, but that doesn't mean the student will be able to do it effectively. You have to just force the student to practice it over and over, and then the brain will gradually start to figure out how to think in this different way, which is very different from the way we think when we're putting English sentences together.
Yeah. That's definitely the best place to start, I think, because if you can't train your brain in the right way to think, then you're going to have problems as you try to go up the ladder. But in keeping with that, it's important, of course, that you practice doing this as much as you can. And while Latin speakers aren't necessarily readily available on every corner, they're out there. So if you practice as much as you can with pretty much anybody you can find, that will go a long way to helping you as well. And maybe people who are interested in doing this can do like you did, Andrew. You can join a Latin Facebook group and end up texting someone as you did.
Right. So, how does a Latin teacher or somebody who's already had a lot of Latin learn how to speak it? I agree with you. I would say if you don't have a neighbor who speaks Latin, and most of us don't, then the internet is the best place to go. And in fact, Facebook is great for this because there are a bunch of Latin groups. It's very easy to find a ton of other people who are speaking Latin that way. Yeah. And if you're interested in learning how to do it, you should get on Facebook. You should make Facebook friends with these people. And then starting out just with text chat, because this is a good first step. Rather than going right into speaking, it's helpful to start with text chat because you have more time to figure out what your response is going to be to what was just said. You can look words up when you need to look words up. It's just a good transition between not conversing at all and then actually speaking with another person. Yeah. And the more you practice, the better you will get, and the faster you'll get better.
Yeah, and this is another advantage, again, of being the times that we live in now compared to when you and I were taking Latin back however many years ago that was for you, but for me it was several decades ago. We didn't really have the internet back then. It's certainly not to the degree that we have it now. There was no Facebook. There was no Skype. I could not just find someone on the internet and converse with them, text chat or otherwise in Latin the way that you can do that now. So there's so many more. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, back when I was first learning Latin, I'd never heard of the internet. That was a long time ago. I guess it existed, but it wasn't something anybody had ever heard of. So there's no question that times have changed. And, you could say, and I think you could say this legitimately, that there are a lot of negative things that come with this. But boy, when it comes to learning a language like this well, it is an excellent, excellent thing that the internet exists, because it allows us to get in contact with each other. You're not going to have a neighbor who speaks Latin, but there will be a lot of other people in the world who do. And it's such a great way to get together with them. And hey, maybe you like some of them, maybe you don't like some of them. Well, if you don't like them, you don't speak Latin with them, but then you speak Latin with the Latin speakers you do like. Just as you would if you were talking to somebody in English.
Yeah. Just quick aside here about the internet. I remember when I was looking for production work as a musician, I remember I came across someone who wanted a producer for one of his songs, and he quoted "Quid est nobiscum." All right, I thought, somebody who speaks Latin, but it actually wasn't. It was one of these people that, and this was a little before Google, I think, so I don't know that he was using Google, but it's just someone who got a Latin dictionary and looked up words and totally disregarded their part of speech. And so you had these crazy things that you have nouns serving as verbs. And I mean, the Latin was horrific. It was horrible, but it was just interesting enough. The song wasn't half bad, but it was interesting enough for me to meet someone who had enough of an interest in trying to make a Latin song, at least. And I never would have met this guy without the internet.
Right. Well, it's somebody who wanted to actually use the language.
Yeah.
and I think that's an important point. If you really want to learn a language, the language has to be alive. So if you persist in thinking that Latin is a dead language, then you're never going to learn it well. But if you allow it to be a living language, so you use it in a living way, then you can learn it extremely well at a very advanced level. And I mean, you and I have talked about this. I think that's the only way to do it. I mean, there's really no other way to learn a language that well.
Yeah, there's no substitute for the real thing. When it comes down to it, there's just no way to get around it. And as we said, in the beginning of the show here, and it just bears repeating because it's so much more enjoyable. It really is. Trust us, guys. I mean, if you've had anything, if you've ever had any inclination to do this, just know that the rewards that you can get from this are so great when you get to the end of this, and even before you get to the end, when you're in the midst of doing it, if you're following a certain course of study, as we've spoken of here today, you'll just find it to be so much more appealing than it would otherwise be without that. As I mentioned when we were talking before, it was a bizarre concept to me not to speak the language. For me, that was strange, not to speak it. I couldn't fathom that. And I don't know how I would have gotten along without speaking it.
Yeah, well, I think that that's what a lot of kids think. And it's only after they've been told over and over again that it isn't spoken that they learn to accept that as a fact. But I've seen from experience that they are very open to speaking the language. It's always difficult at first. It's difficult for everybody at first, whether you have an advanced degree in Latin or you've just begun to learn the language. It's tough to transition into this new way of using the language, but it's essential. And I just want to, maybe summarize what we've said again. How do you learn to speak Latin effectively? Well, what we've said is you start at the most basic level and you focus on the basics for as long as you need to. Very simple sentences, short sentences, 2-3 word sentences. Then you might move on to 4 or 5 word sentences after a while. But you focus on this until your brain gets used to using the language in the way it needs to be used. You move the words around in the sentence. You vary it as much as you can. And then later on, you move to longer sentences, more vocabulary, more complexity. But there's no reason to rush toward that. Second thing, practice as much as possible with anyone you can find. The more conversation you engage in, the better you'll get at conversation. And as we've said, one of the best ways we found to do that is to get on Facebook, join as many Latin Facebook groups as you can, and then meet other people who are speaking Latin. And it's actually really easy to identify them because they will tend to write Latin in their comments to posts. So you'll very quickly see the level of Latin a person has, and you can maybe identify somebody who would be a good person to talk to in Latin. And then you just need to reach out to that person and start doing it. I mean, I don't even ask people. I just start speaking Latin to them. That's
the way to be, yeah. And something else too is when people see somebody doing something that looks like fun, they want to do it too. And this is what happened when I was talking with my teacher. Gradually, I would notice, and I mean, it's kind of how I started it, as I mentioned, other students in my class would start trying to speak Latin with her. Because they saw how much fun we were having doing it and how much fun I was having enjoying it. And I would say, oh, yeah, you should try this. It's great. It's wonderful. And they did. And they enjoyed it, too.
Well, the people who speak Latin are the cool kids, and everybody else wants to be like the cool kids.
Naturally.
Yeah. And then the last part of it is it's a good idea to start with conversations that are text conversations. So on Facebook or Skype, rather than jumping right into oral conversations, start with text because it gives you more time to think about what you're going to say, to compose your sentence, to look up words if you need to. But you don't have so much time that you don't have that pressure that forces you to learn the vocabulary. So it's a really nice way to do it, I found. And then gradually you hopefully will move to oral conversations after that. But when you do, when you start doing it, I think if you haven't done it before, you will very quickly realize that this is something you should have always been doing.
Yeah.
Because it's so much fun. It's so positive for getting better at the language. And more than anything else, I mean, it really is the only effective way to learn vocabulary, to learn it well and learn it permanently.
And there's something else you can do as well. So if you're a Latin teacher, and you've probably heard our spots on this throughout this podcast and previous episodes as well, you are more than welcome to join our Conversational Latin workshop for teachers, which we hold over Skype every week. And it's important that everyone knows now that these are not freewheeling conversation groups. This is an actual class. So Andrew and I are the teachers of this class, and we take you step by step through the entire curriculum, as we've tried to do here today in this episode of the show, based on the textbook that Andrew has written. And it's good too because everyone is taught at their own particular level. So there isn't this pressure that exists where you feel you have to come in and live up to the most proficient person's knowledge level or level of being able to speak the language. That does not exist. Right. Everyone is taught at their own level. And
so people have slightly different levels in the class, but as you said, the teacher teaches each individual student individually. So the teacher will ask students questions that are appropriate for those students. A student won't be faced with something that will be impossible for him right off the bat. He'll be taught from the most basic level and brought along gradually. As you were saying, Kostas, I'm sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no, that's quite all right. And, I like to think we're pretty experienced and somewhat knowledgeable in what we're doing. And that always helps when you have people who've done it before, as we both have.
Right. So, yeah, I don't think it's been mentioned, but you and I are the teachers of this class.
I slipped it in there subtly. I don't know if people heard it, but that's fine if you want to say it again.
Right. So we trade off. So Kostas will teach the class one week, and then I'll teach it the next week, and then it's back to Kostas, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a little bit of variety. The students get to learn from two different teachers. And it's just a huge amount of fun. It is really wonderful to see these people learning how to speak the Latin language. And it's never as difficult as they think it's going to be. Right. They come the first time, and almost 100% of the time they'll say, "Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I can do this. We'll see how it goes." And then they pick it up so much more easily than they thought they would. It's been in them all along. They just needed to exercise that muscle in order to really learn how to do it well.
Absolutely. And we are there to support you every step of the way. So that's another big thing. We don't leave anybody behind. We don't let anyone fall through the cracks. We will lift you up and carry you through on your journey to conversational Latin proficiency. Right.
So, obviously, you don't have to do it with us, but, if you are interested in that, these are free classes that are open for Latin teachers, not open to anybody, just open to Latin teachers. So if you teach Latin, you can join the Skype class, which meets on Tuesday evenings. That's one option. But the other option, as we said, is to kind of go it alone. Find people you can practice with and then just do it. It isn't as tough as you think it is. It's just a matter of getting down to it and doing it and learning by doing.
Yeah, and it's so much fun. We keep saying this, but it really is true. It is so much fun. You'll wonder how you ever got along without it. as I do now, sitting here reflecting, thinking about how I ever would have gotten where I got without it. So if people want to know more about the conversation class, or they want to check out our textbook, where should they go to find this, Andrew?
Well, so the grayfoxtutors.com website is where they should go. grayfoxtutors.com, gray spelled with an E. If you go to the website, on the home page, there is a button in the top right that says Latin Teacher Resources. If you click on that, it will go to a part of our website, which we call the archives. And that's where we have a large variety of resources for Latin teachers. And among those resources is our Conversational Latin textbook. And I encourage you all to go and download it. It's all free. Everything in there is downloaded for free. We don't charge for anything. We just, want to provide Latin teachers with these resources so that they're better able to teach their students. We have resources that are about conversational Latin, but then we also have resources that help teachers teach Latin grammar as well, because we believe in both of those things equally. These are two essential pillars to learning the Latin language. If you go into the archives, there will be a link that will take you to the page for the Conversational Latin class for teachers. It'll be at the top. And on that page, there will be all sorts of information about what the class is about, how you can get in contact with us to join the class, etc.
Yeah, and as always, we love it when you subscribe to our podcast. So if you haven't done that already, please consider doing it, because we have many, many more episodes that we will be putting out here in the coming weeks. And we're always coming up with new ideas and new things to discuss. So we've got a lot of exciting stuff planned. And it's been a busy year anyway. That's why it took us a few months to come back. But we are back now, and we are ready and raring to go. With that, it looks like we've just about come to the end of our show today. This was a great topic to discuss, I think, in our first show back. Andrew, it's been a real pleasure talking about this with you once again.
It has been a fun conversation for me, but I always love talking about this. The problem is you usually can't shut me up.
Well, that's okay. We'll work on that. All right. So thank you, everybody, for listening to us once again. And please join us next time, once again, when we'll be back with another episode of the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. Valete, everyone.